everyone. Welcome to today's Daily Dose. I was recently on a walk with a friend, and she was kind of thoughtfully reflecting with me on the fact that her husband, who has done manual labor for a career for his whole life, he's starting to realize that his body might not be able to handle that type of work forever. And it's not that he's not capable of trudging ahead and just making it work, but he's kind of reached a juncture where he's realizing just because it's something he's always done, it doesn't mean he should continue doing it indefinitely. And yet, even though his body, maybe even his heart, are telling him that he should make a change, it's not necessarily that simple. It affects their whole family system. It affects that part of his identity that he's been in the same line of work for much of his life. And even if he makes the decision to change careers, where does he begin to start thinking about something different, something totally new? Regardless of what career you are in, I can imagine you might ask yourself a similar question if you find yourself at a crossroads like that. It's not a given that any of us could easily make room for a change in our careers. Making room for any kind of change is hard. But what if changing is something we simply need to do? We might find ourselves wondering, where do we turn for some kind of holy sign that we're making the right change, the best change, maybe even the easiest change? Change often, if we're honest, causes us to have a scarcity mentality. We hold on to the things we know really close to us with a tight grip. And the unknown around us, it causes a lot of fear to bubble up. How do I begin to make room for change? I think when we ask a question like this at any time in our lives, it can help us to look to the Bible for wisdom, for guidance, for comfort. And today I invite you to open your Bibles to the book of John, chapter 2, where there is a story about change. Now, some brief context to start. If you were to read the entire book of John, you would notice 7 signs that Jesus performs throughout the book. Some of them are unique to this particular book in the Bible. Others overlap with stories that you'd find in other Gospels. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you would hear them referred to as miracles. Now, the author of John uses the term signs very intentionally. These signs, they point to some kind of truth about Jesus that goes beyond the event itself. Okay, so keeping that in mind, chapter 2 starts with the first significant sign in John, where Jesus attends a wedding at a place called Cana. Now, here's what you need to know about weddings in Jesus' day. Those wedding ceremonies weren't just 30-minute ceremonies with a dance to follow on a nice Saturday in the fall. They were huge. They were community-wide. They were big celebrations. Sometimes they would last a week. And we read in John chapter 2 that Jesus' mother happens to be with him at this wedding, along with Jesus' disciples. Early in this story, in verse 3, in fact, we learn that the wine runs out. Now, this would have been shocking. It would have been embarrassing at a wedding in ancient Palestine. The wine, it was expected that it would last through the very end of the celebration. So Jesus' mother points this out to him, and he responds, it seems a little bit offhanded by saying, well, I'm a guest at this wedding, so what do I care? That was the wedding planner's job. What concern is it to you and me, Jesus says. And yet, his mother seems to ignore this comment, so she turns to the servants of the house and says, do whatever he tells you. She lifts up Jesus' responsibility. And this is the part of the story that many of you have likely heard. Jesus sees 6 stone water jars. These were the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing. The Bible tells us they were each capable of holding 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus says to the servants at this wedding, fill the jars with water. And so they fill them to the brim, and Jesus tells them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He, the master, did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then the master calls the bridegroom aside and says, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests who have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now. This famous story of Jesus changing water into wine. So here we are looking at this story today, and we're wondering, what can we learn from this about changes we might face in our life? Well, first, if we think about it as a sign pointing us to something about Jesus rather than as a miracle, we should remember this is a wedding banquet. It's somewhat of an everyday, ordinary celebration. Jesus, as one preacher I know writes, introduces the presence of God into the day-to-day of being human. The changes that God offers into our lives don't have to happen in a church or in a highly religious ceremony. Those 6 jars, yes, they were used for Jewish purification rites where people were required to cleanse themselves before entering the temple, and yet here, in a completely unexpected way, not only is the water within these jars turned into wine so that there's enough for everybody at the wedding, but it's good wine. It's the best wine. It is, in fact, more wine than they ever would have needed. When God is involved in changes we face, it leads to abundance. It leads to unexpected graces. When we depend on relationships of those around us, not just on ourselves, and we depend on God who never leaves us, change, even when it involves the old, like those jars, change can overflow into something pretty amazing.